It is day 9 of the League's 5 early reveals, and today is by far the biggest drop we just got, and honestly it might be the biggest reveal we have of all of the days leading up to the Leagues. Today they released all of the combat masteries, how they're going to work, how you unlock them. Before we jump into each tier, let's talk about how they work. In total, you're going to be able to earn up to 10 total combat mastery points. Each point is earned by completing one of the following tasks down here at the bottom left. Things like defeating a giant will get you 1 point, which will be a very good one to get started early out of the gate. But then all the way down to unlock your final 10th point, you will have to defeat Zuck. Same goes for your second to last point. To unlock your 9th mastery, you will need to complete 3 unique echo bosses, being all 3 echo bosses in your regions. As you progress your way through all 6 tiers, you will unlock passives that apply to any combat style. And in order to progress to tier 2 of a combat style, so if I want to be tier 2 or tier 3 of melee, you have to buy the previous tier. Which that one you would assume would be pretty obvious. If you want to get the tier 4 melee, you have to buy the first 3 tiers of melee. But if we go ahead and break through all of the 10 tasks, the first one is defeating a giant. Then we have defeating 10 monsters with a combat level over 100. Defeating Scurrius by yourself. Defeating a monster with a Slayer requirement of above 55. Finishing a fight cave and killing Jad. Reaching a total combat level of 100, defeating one of your echo bosses, defeating 2 unique echo bosses, and then as we touched earlier, the second to last one to get your 9th point is defeating all 3 of your echo bosses, and then finally defeating Zuck and completing the Inferno. Honestly, I think this is an incredibly unique and interesting way to go about unlocking each specific tier. Now before we jump into all of the specifics, I do want to mention, if you didn't already notice, there are 6 total tiers. But you have the ability to unlock 10 different sections. And how you unlock those and what choices you make is entirely up to you. You can spend all of your first 6 to max out range and then balance and go 4 melee with your next 4. You could go 4, 4, and 2. You could go 4, 3, and 3. You can do whatever combination you want in order to get those total of 10. Not only is a Tribrid League very possible this time around, but you are guaranteed to at least be able to max out an entire combat style and add at least 4 onto another, if that's the route you went with unlocking your 10 sections. But now for all of the passives, and these do impact any of the combat styles, they are not specific. The passive for completing any of the tier 1 slots gives you a 95% chance to save weapon charges, ammo, and runes that you've used for spells. The passive for tier 2 is healing from all sources is increased by 20%. The tier 3 passive is accuracy with all styles is increased by 100%. Tier 4 is damage taken is reduced by 15%. The passive for tier 5 is prayer point gain from all sources is increased by 25%. Every single dose of your prayer pot increases by 25% more than it would have prior. And then lastly, the passive for tier 6, attacks with all styles now have a 60% prayer penetration. First up for Melee's Tier 1, Melee hits have a 25% chance to roll damage twice, and you will just end up hitting whatever is the higher result. Nothing too crazy, but just overall a massive DPS jump, with nothing else really needed. And I do want to touch on the passive for Tier 1 is just outrageously strong. 95% chance of saving runes and ammo. The constant effort of trying to re-up having supply for things like a blowpipe is going to be much easier with this passive. Tier 2 for melee, hits have a 10% chance to generate an echo hit. And echo hits are additional melee hits, 50% of your max hit, and respects accuracy, and it does only apply to PVM. So nothing too crazy here, just a 10% chance to generate an additional hit that can only hit half of what your original max is. And I do want to confirm so there isn't any confusion for some people. Once you unlock the next tier, you still keep the access of what you got from the original tier. It isn't like once you unlock tier 2, this is the only ability you have. Once you get to tier 6, you will have access and the abilities from all 6 of these tiers. Now for tier 3, melee attack rates set to 80% rounded down. And this is where things massively change. This is the exact same for all 3 combat styles in tier 3. Not only are you getting a massive 100% buff to your accuracy with the passive, now overall this is a really nice buff that just makes everything attack a little bit faster. But once we get over to tier 5 for all of the weapons, it absolutely changes up what's going to be meta with what weapons you're going to want to use. Tier 4 for melee, hits have a 5% chance to heal 40% of the damage dealt. Depending on what relics you end up going with, healing might not be the most difficult thing to upkeep, especially with the passive from tier 2 being healing from all sources being increased by 20%. At the same time, just having an additional 5% chance to not to even take the time to eat and not losing out on any of those ticks is just a nicer way to deal with your upkeep of DPS from your initial few relics. Now for tier 5, melee attack rate set to 50%, and anything above 5 tick is rounded down, anything below 4 tick is rounded up. And overall, this is always a much bigger buff to the weapons that have slower attack speeds that hit harder. So if you take a few examples, we have things like a scythe which attacks at 5 ticks. Anything above 5 ticks would round down, so you would divide it by 2, giving you 2.5. Rounding down puts you at 2, meaning the scythe's attack speed would be 2 ticks with tier 5, which to give you an idea, attacks as fast as a blowpipe does on rapid. And since they're identical for tier 5, if we go down the list and talk about both mage and range, things like the shadow would now be a 2 tick attack speed. And then something like the blowpipe that already attacks on 2 ticks when you're using rapid will now be halved down to 1 tick. So once again, you would have access to a 1 tick blowpipe, and even better, a 1 tick Drygore blowpipe if you do take the desert route. Before we go any further though, the tier 6 for melee is your chance to generate a melee echo hit increases to 20%. And this is the same echo hit from tier 2, but your echoes have the ability to generate an additional echo up to 8 times in a row. I can't even begin to fathom how strong this actually is, but comparing it up against what you're going to offer in the range and magic tier 6s, I can only imagine how massive of a DPS buff this tier 6 for melee is going to be. Using something like a scythe, you're going to have the ability to hit like 8 different hit splats in one time. Obviously you wouldn't see all of them, but the damage you're going to do in the background is pretty mental. And for tier 1 on range, damage rolls beneath 30% of your max hit are increased to 30%. Tier 2 is each subsequent ranged attack has its max hit increased by an additional 5%, and this resets every time you hit 20% over. So the first time you attack, your max hit buffed by 5%, the second time it would be buffed by 10, the third time it would be buffed by 15, and then the fourth time it would be buffed by 20, resetting back to 5 on the 5th attack. Tier 3, like we touched on earlier, ranged attacks rate set down to 80% of the max. Nothing insane in terms of power, but definitely a very nice buff along your way to unlocking some of the later tiers. Tier 4 for range, every 5th range hit you will heal 5 hit points. Comboing this with the tier 3 and then ultimately the tier 5 when you're attacking as fast as you're going to be attacking. With how fast range already is as a style, healing 5 hit points every 5th attack is going to be like just a constant health regen at all times. And for tier 5, as we touched on earlier, your range attack speed is halved. Anything above 5 is rounded down, anything below 4 is rounded up. Blowpipe moves all the way down to 1 tick, making it probably one of the strongest weapons in leagues. And then comboing this with the final tier 6. This is a PVM only tier, but you will never miss with range. Now lastly, let's talk mage. When you roll above 90% of your max hit with magic, damage will be increased by 50%. So basically your hard hits will just hit harder. Tier 2 is max magic hit is increased by 5% per tick in between your attacks. With every tick you let pass by, you will get an additional 5% onto your max hit until you hit the cap of an additional 40%. So if you waited 8 ticks between every magic hit you attacked with, your max hit would be increased by 40% every time you casted a spell. Tier 3, the mage attack speed set down to 80% rounded down. Now for tier 4, when you roll above 90% of your max hit, just like we had with the tier 1s, except this time the secondary effect you're going to get is you will heal 10% of the damage you dealt. So if your max hit was something like a 44 and you hit a 40, you would get 4 HP back for that attack. This one does in turn sound weaker than the melee and range versions, but I feel like you also have to take into account you have access to things like Ancients where you can already use Blood Barrage with magic. You combo Blood Barrage with the magic attack speed of tier 3 or tier 5, and tier 4 really just kind of becomes irrelevant with how much healing you already have access to. But now for tier 6 of mage, and one of the wordiest ones we have, your max hit with magic is increased by 1% for every 100 HP remaining on your target. This is an increase of only up to 10%, so the stronger the boss is that you fight and the more health they have, the harder you can hit. But as a secondary on a successful magic hit, if your target has less HP than your max hit, you will always max hit. Which means once you buff up your gear, doing things like Slayer with magic become incredibly efficient. Not only is it going to give you the ability to one-hit some monsters, but even the monsters that have higher HP than whatever your max is, as soon as you get them below like half, you are just going to one-hit the remaining HP. The secondary effect of magic is definitely weaker when it comes to boss fights, which makes total sense why there is a second effect at the start where you do slightly more damage to bigger bosses with more health. In the end, these tier 6s are going to be insane DPS increases on all three combat styles. And honestly, these things dramatically shake up what this league is going to look like, especially when it came to what combat style people were going with. Just like previous leagues, everybody came in with the notion they were going to be picking one combat style and that's all the options they had. But the way combat masteries work, they actually changed everything. Now there might be better region combos that people weren't considering prior because they're better off for both melee and mage, or better off for both range and mage. Regions that give you access to 2-for-1s where they can give you good mage gear and range gear, or melee gear and range gear, or access to specific weapons. But if we look down to what the tasks are to unlock these specific masteries, things like the Giant, the 10 monsters over 100, Scurious, getting 55 Slayer, and killing any of those monsters, those 4 right there give you your first 4 combat masteries. And at that point, you would be picking between the next 3 of completing Jad, which can be done at very low level already. Add in the benefits you're going to be getting from the initial tiers of masteries, and this can definitely be one done at not a very high combat level, which then puts you in the position of unlocking your 6th, either through defeating your first Echo boss or reaching combat level 100. And we don't know how hard these Echo bosses are going to be, and it definitely will depend on which regions you're picking. Some Echo bosses are going to be much harder than others. Things like Soul or Dagonoth Kings are definitely not ones you're going to be wanting to try out for your first one. If I had to guess, the one that sticks out off the top of my head would be people going Corinne and having access to Hispori. Unfortunately, with that one, you do have to wait for the timer of the initial seed to actually grow. The benefit you do have is once it grows, it is a guaranteed Echo Crystal drop. So there will be an interesting balance between waiting for that thing to grow and people getting all of their combats ready to attack their first Echo in their regions. But overall, this was in no way what I was expecting from Combat Masteries. Yes, a lot of the individual tiers are something kind of what we were expecting. Things like making the attack speed slower, offering secondary healing effects, or just massive buffs to DPS. All those general ideas were definitely expected, but the way it turned out in offering massive passives for each of the given tiers, and then potentially making it the most Tribrid heavy league we have ever seen was definitely a change of pace I didn't see coming. But if you stuck around this long, thank you guys so much for watching. Those are all of the combat masteries, everything you need to know about how they're going to work. I think in terms of DPS, one of the strongest tiers on the entire list is going to be the tier 5s of the halved attack speeds. Even taking out all of the secondary effects of just bonus DPS and healing, some of those in-game weapons just with attack half speeds are already strong by themselves. I'm very interested to see if, now that this is released, it changes people's plans on what style they were going with. Maybe they change the regions because they want to do a kind of 2-style meta. And instead of going all the way to 1 tier 6, you just take 2 styles up to tier 5. At this given moment, I think I would take melee up to tier 6, but I have no idea what I would do with the remaining 4 points. At the same time, progressing to killing all 3 of your Echoes and Zuck aren't exactly the 2 freest final points to unlock. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop it a like, and I will catch you in the next one.